Be it racism or the coronavirus, economy or immigration, the U.S. is on a knife edge. As America gets ready to vote in a highly polarized election.
Is it possible for the United Nations?
We present facts first and the issues that matter. Voice of America and WION collaborate to bring you India's biggest coverage of U.S. election 2020. Every Friday at 7:30 p.m. IST. The world is watching. Are you?
We're going to win 4 more years in the White House.
This is peace in the Middle East without blood all over the sand.
I trust vaccines, I trust scientists, but I don't trust Donald Trump.
Welcome to WION VOA co-production, our special weekly presentation, bringing you a comprehensive coverage on US election 2020. I'm Akankah Swaroop. Now, with less than 2 months for the US presidential election, President Donald Trump hosted the signing of the Abraham Accords on Tuesday, a deal that normalizes Israel's relations with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. Experts say the accords signify a shift away from the decades-long regional strategy that, in exchange for diplomatic recognition, Israel must provide concessions to the two-state solution towards an independent Palestinian state. Voice of America's White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara brings you this story.
President Donald Trump said he is marking the dawn of a new Middle East as foreign ministers from the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain joined Israel's prime minister at the White House Tuesday to sign the Abraham Accords, normalizing the 2 Gulf Arab states with Israel.
In Israel's entire history, there have previously been only 2 such agreements. Now we have achieved 2 in a single month, and there are more to follow.
The agreements are part of a broader diplomatic effort by the Trump administration to pressure Palestinians into accepting a peace deal, a strategy that experts call the outside-in approach.
And that is, if everybody recognizes Israel in its current borders, in its de facto control over all of Jerusalem, over the West Bank, and even the Gaza Strip, that would eventually force Palestinians essentially to acquiesce and leave them no choice, really, but to surrender to this reality on the ground.
You could say it's a back door, but I call it a smart door, not a back door.
Analysts say the agreement between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel reflect a changing regional calculation on the two-state solution.
This is really a consolidation of some of the geopolitical shifts that we've been seeing that have been coming for decades, but that show that Arab Gulf states and Israel have more in common in terms of their opposition to Iran than they have in opposition in relation to their views on Palestinian aspirations for statehood.
Less than 2 months before the U.S. election, the Trump administration is touting the Abraham Accords as a foreign policy win. And while foreign policy may not rank as high of an election issue compared to the evangelical Christians, who Pew data reports made up about a third of the president's supporters during the 2016 race. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News.
So what will be the impact of this deal on the US election? Let's get in an analysis by Voice of America's Nova Poerwadi, who joins me live from Washington, D.C. at this hour. Hey, Nova, I hope you're doing great. And thank you for joining this broadcast. Now, Nova, how important is the issue of Middle East peace for the US voter? Is it important to act on?
Well, Middle East peace and also the conflict, long-running conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians is an issue that stirs strong emotions among some circles in many, many countries. I believe even India supports the peace deal offered by President Trump, the Trump administration, the two-pronged peace deal that focuses on the economy and also on the political and security aspects of Middle Eastern peace. And in the U.S., you could say that the U.S. voters are predominantly pro-Israel. The latest Gallup poll asking voters whether they were more pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian showed that around 60% of U.S. voters are more pro-Israel, whereas the number that describe themselves as more pro-Palestinian is around 25%. Now, as for the deal itself, it is receiving a majority support among voters. 54% of those polled in a recent YouGov and The Economist poll say they support the deal between the UAE, Bahrain, to normalize relations with Israel. Now, if you break that down along partisan lines, more Republicans support it than Democrats. You have 62% of Republicans supporting it, but it's also a majority of Democrats supporting it, around 53%. Now, the issue of Middle East peace is also a preoccupation of successive U.S. administrations, and each president has tried in one way or another to influence and to broker Middle East peace with varying degrees of success. Under Jimmy Carter's administration, you had the deal with Egypt that normalized relations with Israel in 1979. And under President Bill Clinton, you also had the deal that normalized relations with Jordan in 1994. In fact, that was the last time an Arab country normalized relations with Israel. So this is something that the Trump administration can tout as one of its successes.
Right.
Now, whether this translates to electoral gain remains to be seen. We'll have to see whether the polls indicate a shift, Akankah.
That's precisely what I'm going to come to next, Nova. It's very interesting, actually. Is this deal and foreign policy in general likely to sway the American voters one way or the other?
Well, the UAE-Bahrain-Israel Accord does add something that President Trump can, as an incumbent, can point to his accomplishments. Certainly, everyone can agree that President Trump's foreign policy is rather unconventional in its approach. But due to its unconventional nature, we've seen several surprises, including his overtures with North Korea. President Trump went from Rocket Man and Fire and Fury to having 3 summits with Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. So these are some of the breakthroughs that President Trump, as an incumbent, can tout as his achievements. Now, whether that will sway voters or not remains to be seen. There's also a difference in approach with Democrats. Democrats feel his overtures to Kim Jong-un and also to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and also to Russia are pretty much coddling or cozying up to dictators is the word that Joe Biden, the presidential candidate for the Democrats, and also Kamala Harris, his running mate, seem to accuse President Trump of being. And even European nations, leaders of European nations, often consider him to be harsher on allies than he is with normally adversaries like Iran or North Korea. So these are some of the controversies. And whether this swings the pendulum one way or another, a recent Pew Research poll showed the divergence of priorities between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans, their top two priorities are the economy and violent crime, whereas Democrats are healthcare and the coronavirus. For both groups, though, they consider foreign policy very low. Very low on the ladder, so sixth ranking of priorities. So it's not likely a game changer, but breakthroughs like the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel deal, the Abraham Accords, certainly don't hurt an incumbent president.
Certainly, Nova. It is indeed a breakthrough on the international stage, but we'll have to wait and watch to see if that foreign policy gain actually, how that translates into the domestic arena. For now, let's also talk about the battleground states. Though the southern United States have leaned towards Republicans for decades, North Carolina, which President Donald Trump won in the year 2016, is a battleground state, or call it a swing state. The presidential polls indicate that Joe Biden is giving Trump stiff competition. From Charlotte, VOA's Aisha Sarai has more.
Staunch supporters of President Trump are confident he will carry North Carolina in November, but acknowledge it will be a tight race.
North Carolina is a swing state. People think, if possibly could go. I can guarantee you that North Carolina will be going for President Trump. It's going to be a close race. I expect he'll carry North Carolina by 2-3 percentage points.
Joe Biden's supporters are working to rally support for the Democrat in North Carolina and getting varied reactions from voters.
It's mixed. It's about a mix. Today's been a lot of Biden. We're really surprised in this area. But on the freeways, a lot of birds. But it's been great. I need a better president. I need a president that can read and write and that can be for the people. So that's why we're here.
Democrat Barack Obama narrowly won North Carolina in 2008. The state went Republican in the next two elections by fewer than 4 percentage points. Recent polls have shown Biden leading the state by razor-thin margins.
Our state is very bitterly divided, but it's an even division between the partisans. And so the likelihood is both sides will get anywhere from 43 to 45, 46% of their respective votes. But it's that last sliver of persuadable voters that could flip from one side to the other that really makes North Carolina as competitive as any place else in the country.
In addition to the presidential race, North Carolina features a hotly contested Senate race that could help determine which party controls the legislative chamber. Aisha Sarai, VOA News, Charlotte, North Carolina.
Let's talk a bit more about swing states like North Carolina. For that, I'm going back to Voice of America's Nova Poerwadi, who's joining me from Washington, D.C. at this hour. Nova, explain to us how razor-thin the margins are between Donald Trump and Joe Biden's support in North Carolina.
Well, we mentioned how razor-thin it is, and it is actually when you take the average of several major polls recently done in North Carolina. The difference, the lead that Joe Biden has is 0.2%. 0.2%. That's how razor thin it is. And this is, of course, an average of several polls that showed either Joe Biden ahead or Donald Trump ahead. And even in polls where Joe Biden leads, it's 2 to 4 points ahead. Certainly within reach of the margin of error of some polls. That's how razor thin it is. And this is an interesting state because it is in the South and it usually trends Republican, but Barack Obama won it in 2008, and he did so by just 14,000 votes. This is one of the most razor-thin margins in general elections, all for North Carolina's 15 electoral college votes. Now, I've mentioned before that both camps are not taking anything for granted, and so they are looking to either sway North Carolina to the Democrats or to keep North Carolina in the red camp. And it doesn't get any swingy than North Carolina, Akankah.
No more swinging than North Carolina. But on that note, Nova, I'd also like to get in a sense of how the Republicans look at it, or even how the Democrats look at it. Let's draw a contrast. Now, are there differences in how each candidate over here, be it Donald Trump or Joe Biden, how do they approach these battleground states?
Well, it's interesting because it's not a popularity contest. It's not about the popular vote, but about the electoral college votes. Majority of the campaigns are going to be held in battleground states, swing states such as North Carolina. You'll see the candidates themselves go to these states, and for safe bet states like California and New York are heavily Democratic, so there doesn't need to be much of a presence there. Maybe they can send surrogates or the VP candidate. But Donald Trump and Joe Biden has to go to these swing states in order to convince the local voters. You see a stark difference between the two campaigns. Joe Biden and the Democrats are portraying themselves as taking the coronavirus pandemic seriously. So you'll see him out with a mask along with his entourage, and also giving elbow bumps instead of handshakes and such. Whereas President Trump is resuming mass rallies where he thrives, because he thrives off the energy of the audience, and vice versa. And these rallies are pretty much similar to what he held before the pandemic. They're usually held outdoors for social distancing purposes, but not a lot of masks, as one New York Times reporter tweeted one time.
Right.
So there are difference of approaches, and of course there's also the airwaves. The battle for voters is not only on the ground but also on the airwaves, and we see here a competition to blast ads both on the internet and on TV. Republicans have spent since June around $6 million in a state like Georgia, which hasn't really voted Democrat since 1992. And conversely, Michael Bloomberg has promised to has pledged $100 million to help Joe Biden win Florida, which is also a swing state where Democrats have a 50-50 chance, or even less of swinging to their side, Akankah.
Absolutely. It is precisely these contrasts which are making the US election this year so polarized. On that note, thank you so much, Nova Poerwadi, for bringing us all those inputs and sharing your brilliant analysis on our special co-production. We'll keep coming back to you every Friday.